welcome to the Holiday Podcast, where we sit over some fresh-baked challah bread on Friday afternoons here at my dining room table. I'm your host, Tammy, priest, a Jewish follower of Jesus, and it's great to be with you this week as we take another look at this intersection of the old and the new. I missed being with you all last week, but I was having a different kind of holiday. A friend asked me to make challah for her women's retreat. So I ended up making challah for 30 women, which was a real treat actually. But it's great to be back with you today. So people have been talking a lot about Pentecost over the last couple weeks, myself included. It was a couple weeks ago on the Jewish calendar, which we talked about, and then on the Roman calendar, our calendar, last week. Now, I know that so often on Sunday mornings, Bible stories, like what happened at Pentecost, are taught, especially to our kids, but not how all these stories are connected or about the ways that all these people in the Old Testament are connected to each other in really meaningful ways. And the problem is that when we disconnect these significant people and events from each other, we miss out on so much about who God is, not just for them back then, but for us today. And Pentecost is a great example of this connectedness. We talked a little bit about that last time, but a lot of times when I teach, people are shocked that Pentecost is a Jewish thing. And it's because a lot of Christians don't realize that the Pentecost in Acts 2, when the Holy Spirit came down, was actually an annual feast. The Feast of Pentecost, or Shavuot, which means weeks in Hebrew, is one of the three pilgrimage feasts. So Pentecost was already a big deal on the Jewish calendar, which we'll come back to in a minute. I mean, Jews today still celebrate it. But last time on holiday, we talked about that 50-day countdown between Passover and Pentecost, how they're tied together that way. And we talked about how in Leviticus and Numbers, God told his people to start counting off 50 days, starting with the Passover Sabbath. And that 50th day would be Pentecost. And that's actually why it's called Pentecost, because Pentecost means 50th in Greek. And we talked about how the people thought they were counting down to one thing, right? Offering the first fruits of their harvest at the feast, which is what God commanded. But they didn't realize they were counting down to something greater than they could have ever imagined. The Holy Spirit of God, part of the divine Godhead, dramatically coming down to dwell within them, within us. But there's another piece of this Pentecost connectedness that I wanted to talk about for just a minute today. And I love it because it points to God's incredible intentionality. Now remember, both Passover and Pentecost are pilgrimage feasts, which I said earlier. So on the first day of this 50-day countdown, Jerusalem was just busting at the seams with people who had just witnessed with their own eyes and ears the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, because they're all there for the pilgrimage feast. And then they all went home to tend to their crops and their everyday lives as they counted down to the harvest and the next pilgrimage feast, when they would come back to Jerusalem to offer their first fruits. I mean, can you imagine what those conversations were like on their journeys back home after that Passover pilgrimage feast? Or the talk around the dinner table during those 7 weeks in between, when they were anticipating their trip back to Jerusalem. But then, when they finally come back for Pentecost, the 50th day, they arrive to this even more incredible news that Jesus had, ascended through the clouds into the heavens in front of everyone just a few days earlier, before they had gotten there for the feast, which is just another piece of this mind-blowing thing that was happening right in real time. the Messiah crucified, resurrected, and now ascending into heaven. But we know that it wasn't over, because after they'd caught up on the news of Jesus's ascension, they went about doing what they were in Jerusalem to do in the first place. They gathered all these God followers from different communities and countries, and they offered their first fruits, and they waved their loaves of bread. So let me read about that day from Acts chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard them speaking in his own language. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in his own native language?" Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked each other, "What does this mean?" The whole reason there were all these foreign speakers in Jerusalem at that moment is because it was a pilgrimage feast. And so when the Holy Spirit came down, it was really this total reversal of Babel, right? Different languages uniting people instead of scattering them, uniting them with the gospel that they could then take back home and share with their neighbors in all the nations. God was so intentional. When he gave those pilgrimage commands way back in the desert, he knew exactly what was going to happen on this one particular Passover and Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles too, which we talked about in the fall. But God knew that if his people obeyed the pilgrimage command, they would come to Jerusalem at Passover and witness the Messiah's salvation sacrifice and his defeat of death. And that if they again obeyed the pilgrimage command, they'd receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, uniting people who don't even share the same language into the united family of God. And then all these pilgrims would each take the complete story of the gospel back home with them and share their eyewitness accounts with other people. I mean, God's plan is so much bigger than we can possibly comprehend. I know I say that every week, but it's so true. And I don't know about you, but when I see how these feasts were woven so intentionally together, 1,500 years after God commanded them, it reassures me that our God has a plan, a good, beautiful, powerful plan. And that he can be trusted to fulfill his promises in just the right way, at just the right time, as we continue to seek and follow him and his ways, both in our own lives and in how we care for each other. And so on this holiday, this Sabbath Eve, no matter where you are on your pilgrimage with God, I pray that you would find rest and encouragement in him. Shabbat Shalom.